So just like any other regular kit I build, I'm going to do the same thing here. Start with scribing out the panel lines, then sand the body, clean it up, and move on to primer. The only thing that is different in this case is that the body is resin, and the resin isn't really that great for your health, so be sure to do this in a well-ventilated area, and if you can, also wear a respirator, as you don't really want to be breathing in the dust of this resin that you're scribing out and sanding off the body. It's pretty toxic and again not good for your health, so keep that in mind. So the same as always, the scribing is done and I can move on to scuffing the rest of the body up with 600 grit to get it nice and grippy and also smooth for the primer to go onto. Once the entire body was sanded, I moved on to removing some of the dust with various brushes and then placed it on my Tamiya spray stand. I have links to those products down in the description below as well. I blew it over with the airbrush, just blowing on air to remove any of that dust that is still on the body, and then could move on to a first coat of primer, specifically in this case starting with the hard to reach, easy to forget spots, as there are a lot of spots you can easily forget, and then moving on to the regular coat on the rest of the body. With all of the hard to reach, easy to forget spots now covered, I can move on to the rest of the body. I'm giving it a nice thick coat as the body is made out of resin. The primer doesn't really do anything to the resin itself. Opposed to a plastic body, it can grab into it and misform the plastic. With the resin, it doesn't do that, so a heavier coat can be applied. This makes it nice and easy to apply a thicker coat and also build up a bit of a body for the primer, so you can easily sand it off if needed. First coat is applied, and just like the other coats on other plastic kits, I give it 5 minutes in between and then move on to the second coat, applied in the same way I did the first. The second and final coat was applied for the primer stage. I let it sit and dry for about 15 minutes, then moved on to applying the first color. I didn't need to sand the body with the 3000 or 2000 grit, as it was already nice and smooth and it didn't really have any imperfections that needed to be sanded out, so I could just straight away move on to the next stage, and that is applying the color. This is just for the rear half. Since I will be applying carbon fiber decals on all of this, I want a nice matching base color underneath those decals, so if there is a small gap or a small imperfection, it doesn't really show up all that much. So I'm just going to be applying it the same way I did with the primer, hard to reach easy to forget spots first, and then covering the main body itself and also some of those other hard to reach easy to forget spots in the meantime. Another 5 minutes of dry time. I leave the paint in the airbrush in between coats so I can just straight away move on. It doesn't need to be cleaned out as it doesn't harden in 5 minutes and just as easily can be painted again after 5 minutes when left in the airbrush. So this coat is applied in exactly the same way as the first one, just as thick and just to be sure that it's nicely covered. After I finished applying that second coat of gray, it was nicely covered and I set it aside for about 60 minutes to dry. Then I carefully masked everything up to paint that black edge. That is a sort of trim piece on the side of the car. That was just painted in a flat black as I will be covering it with a gloss clear, and in that case it doesn't really matter which black I use, flat, semi-gloss, or gloss, as the clear coat will just make it glossy anyway, and the matte black covers nice and quick and also pretty even. Once the trim pieces were all painted, I carefully started removing the masking tape before again letting it sit for about an hour and then remasking it to paint the main body color for the front section. Another round of masking has been done and I could carefully move on to painting the front half. This color covers nice and quick. It's just a flat gray, no metallics, no pearls, just gray. I applied 2 coats, waiting 5 minutes in between. So same as always, 5 minutes in between, I leave the paint in the airbrush, and then after 5 minutes move on to the second and final coat on the main body color for this front section before carefully starting to peel the masking tape up. The second coat applied, the masking tape removed, and 15 minutes have passed to let that cure a bit. I put it back onto the Tamiya spray stand, mixed up some 2K clear, started by blowing over the body to remove any of the loose or remaining dust that is still on it to get as clean of a clear coat layer as I can, and then of course start on applying that clear coat. Now I'm just going to be applying one coat of clear to get this covered and to make it easier for me to place the decals on top of next. After I finish applying all of the decals, I will clear coat it again, so I'm not going for a perfect finish on this coat, just to cover it and get a bit of a nice smooth finish on mainly the rear section for the decals to be placed on top of. And there you have it. With one, maybe 1.5 coats of clear now applied, it's a nice finish, not super glossy, although it looks pretty good in this photo. I'm going to leave it at this for about 2 to 3 days before I move on to the humongous task of covering all that metallic gray with carbon fiber decals.